Shalom everyone, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves Jonathan here, and I would like to give you a weekly update of what has happened and our war against Hamas. We are at 3:30 a.m. Israeli local time. In 3 hours we will mark a week since the beginning of the war that we are now in the middle or in the start of. And during this briefing I'd like to go over the key events that brought us where we are today, the different events on the ground in the different areas of operation. So we'll be focusing on Gaza, and as before we'll use the map to show you places that we speak about. And we'll speak about the Lebanese front, we'll speak about the Syrian front, and a little bit about regional events, but most importantly we'll speak about the events around the Gaza Strip, how everything started, and then where we are now and what we can anticipate towards the future. As always, we try in the IDF Spokesperson unit to provide you with the best, most honest and recent and updated and trustworthy information based on the information that we have available on the ground. And in this time, at this time, there is an absolute avalanche of information out there. There are videos, there's fake statements, and there are clips, and there's lots of organizations and people that want you to believe different things than the truth. What I'm trying to do here is to provide you with information that we know is true and to give you our perspective on the events. If you like it and if you want our voice to be heard and amplified in the world, please share it. Let's begin. A week ago, -3 hours, Hamas launched the deadliest terror attack ever in Israel's history. A total of 1,300 Israelis have been killed, most of them civilian, many of them executed in their homes or close to their homes, or in their cars trying to flee, or at the music festival. Many have been taken hostage. We have confirmed that there are more than 100 Israeli hostages. There are likely to be more, but that is the official confirmed number, and families that have been given notice by the authorities in Israel. And we have many casualties and more than 3,000 wounded. Those are the most important figures, and that is to remind all of us how we got to where we are. A quick rundown of the recent events. It started with attacks. We have the southern Israel area and the Gaza Strip here behind me. It started with a coordinated, pre-planned, and unfortunately well-executed attack by Hamas, which breached the Erez crossing, which is the humanitarian crossing where Palestinian workers usually go into Israel in order to work and provide salaries for their families. So that very same location was the first target that they struck. They then drove out into different communities, Sderot, and made various breaches along the fence that you can see here, and made their way to different Israeli communities in order to kill, butcher, rape, dismember, and eventually to take hostage Israeli civilians. Locations that I'm sure by now you are familiar with, but that must be mentioned, are Kibbutz Be'eri, which I'm zooming in on right now. You can see this community here. Once upon a time, it was a lush, well-maintained, beautiful community that was home to 1,000 Israelis. Today, 100 of the people who lived in Be'eri, more than 100 were killed. Many were abducted by Hamas and are now in Gaza. So think of that. A community that 1/10 of its members is no longer there, and the entire kibbutz is burnt, houses are ruined, and when we first made our way in, the area looked like a war zone. And unfortunately, Be'eri is not the only place. On the contrary, Kibbutz Kfar Aza, a little bit more to the northeast, as you can see, very close to the border, very close to Gaza, was also the subject of extreme attacks. Many were murdered here. Many were taken hostage into Gaza. and there are reports of atrocities that I don't want to go into again. Suffice to say that the most vile acts of brutality, rape and murder were done in these Israeli communities. Israeli forces responded to the event, and it took us many, many dear hours to get down to the south and to release every village and every community that was under attack, and where Israelis were held at gunpoint, some of them hostage and some of them were just executed in the south. After about 2.5 days, the IDF regained full control over southern Israel, so the entire area was back into Israeli control. We have still had skirmishes and other attacks, attempts by Hamas to breach into Israel from the sea. I'll zoom in a little bit because it's worth mentioning that Hamas many times tries to sail away using, not sailing, but using speedboats, and then make their way to Kibbutz Zikim here, or to one of the facilities in the city of Ashkelon, which they have not been able to reach, but Kibbutz Zikim has unfortunately been attacked many times. Hamas has had very heavy casualties there because we've been able to actively defend, and the Navy has done an excellent job at thwarting most of those attacks. So after that, when we regained control over southern Israel, the focus was to close the fence and make sure that the fence is intact and that future attacks are impossible. That took a lot of work with tanks, infantry, and special forces, and a lot of machinery in order to make sure that the border is closed and not accessible to any terrorists again. It's still not completed, still not back to how it was before, and there is lots of work to do, but that is where we are now. We've mobilized more than 360,000 reserves, and the reserve soldiers are here around the Gaza Strip, in various locations in the south, center, north, and northeast of the Gaza Strip. We're talking about ground units, infantry, artillery, armor, combat engineers, intelligence, logistic troops, etc. are all in their vehicles, tanks, APCs, and artillery pieces, guns focused at Gaza, and they are preparing for their next mission. The situation in Gaza is escalating, and Hamas, I'm sure by now, after 7 days, almost 7 days of fighting, is feeling what a terrible strategic mistake they did when they showed their barbarity and cruelty to the world, and when they executed and killed so many Israeli civilians. Today we are striking in Gaza, all over the Gaza Strip. There's not one single location where we're not striking from the air. We are targeting Hamas and its infrastructure. Everything that supports their military capability to fight us is a legitimate target, and we are striking those targets. So any house used by Hamas operatives is a target. Other facilities, like offices where they plan attacks or execute attacks, is a target. Places where they hide rockets, places where they fire rockets from, locations where their senior terrorists are hiding because they're cowards and they're not fighting out in the open. They're capable of butchering our civilians, but when it comes to fighting against our military, they're not very brave. So they're hiding under the ground in their tunnel network. We target that as well. Regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza, it is indeed a challenging situation, no two words about it. But what we are trying to do is the right thing. We issued a notice to all of the population that lives in northern Gaza, basically this entire area here. We told them we're going to enhance our combat operations in northern Gaza, in Gaza City. For your own safety and for the safety of your families, move south. Now, in order to be clear about where we want them to go, not just a general direction, so if we focus in on Gaza City here, which is the center of Hamas's operations, this is where they stockpile weapons, this is where most of the commanders are, this is where they plan the attacks, this is where they coordinate their efforts against us, so this is really the hub of Hamas's activity. that is what we're going to focus on, and we want the civilians to go from Gaza City south of this thing here. That's the Gaza River, which is clear, and everybody in Gaza knows what the Gaza River is, so we're telling people, go south to the Gaza River, and you can come back only when we will inform you that it is safe to come back. And we're doing it out of respect for human life, because we know it's the right thing to do, and we don't want the civilians to be affected any more than they are by the fighting. Do you know who is trying to stop the evacuation of civilians? Hamas, the very same terrorist organization that brought all this destruction and carnage upon us, upon Israel and on the Gaza Strip, is now telling civilians in Gaza, don't go south. Why? Because they want them there. They want the civilians to stay there so that Israel can be blamed for anything that happens to them. How cynical is that? Not only does Hamas govern the entire Gaza Strip, not only do they use civilians as their human shields, and this has been documented for years. In each and every encounter, each and every war or operation against us, they use their civilians as human shields. They use civilian buildings for their military purposes, which, by the way, is a war crime for those of you who have an affinity to point out war crimes. They also hide behind civilians, and they also have built a network of tunnels that isn't used by the civilians. They're not allowed to go down and seek shelter from what's happening above the ground. This is only for Hamas, for them to be able to fight. So that's the situation, and how cynical is it that we are trying to evacuate Gazan civilians and Hamas is trying to prevent it. Hopefully, the civilians in Gaza will understand what's best for them, and they'll move south of the Gaza River here, and we will be able to operate with less or with no civilians in the area. That's the situation as we speak now in the Gaza Strip. Our troops are prepared. We're preparing for the next stage of operations. And we all understand. I've personally fought inside the Gaza Strip, and so have many of my colleagues in the IDF. It is a very challenging combat environment. It's dense, it's populated, it's narrow, there's very little room to maneuver, and most importantly, it's governed by a terrorist organization that has had time, resources, and the warped thinking to actually prepare the entire Gaza Strip for combat and to use the civilians as their human shields. So we know that if there's a ground maneuver, it will be a very difficult challenge, and that's what we're preparing for. The objective is to dismantle the military capabilities of Hamas. That's what we want to do. We don't define the civilians as our enemy, because they're not, and we don't try to hit anything that isn't related to military activity. We focus our actions on the military components of Hamas until we will be able to dismantle them totally and fundamentally change the situation and the security along our border. Let's speak a little bit about what's going on in the north. The last 12, 18 hours, we've seen a spike in attacks from the north, made by Hezbollah and officially claimed by Hezbollah. They have said, yes, we have done this. Hezbollah has fired an anti-tank missile, actually 2. Hezbollah has tried to infiltrate. Hezbollah has dispatched numerous drones into Israeli territory, and recently, just a few minutes ago, Hezbollah fired an anti-air missile towards an Israeli aircraft, which thankfully was successfully intercepted by our air defense units. The bottom line is, however, that Hezbollah is definitely escalating the situation in the north. The common denominator between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, we actually have to zoom out in order to see the common denominator. We have to zoom out quite a lot and look at the entire Middle East until we get to this country. Iran. Even though it's 600 miles away, or 1,000 kilometers, Iran is virtually on our doorstep, at our doorstep. And the common denominator between Hezbollah and Hamas is that both are funded, equipped, and guided by the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that does not elude our attention. An important thing happening in the Mediterranean, and we've spoken about this before, is the presence of a US battle group, led of course by the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, which is within tactical distance of the Lebanese coast and the Israeli coast, and is here in order to send a clear message of stability and an effort to prevent further escalation in the area. And that's a very important message for anybody watching and thinking about escalating the situation and fighting against Israel. I have to mention again the hostages. We are doing everything we can in order to find more information and in order to devise a plan and then execute it, how to get our hostages out. Our Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said very clearly, we will not rest until all of them are back home. And we will finish this war with a defeated Hamas, dismantled totally of its military capabilities, and when the security situation around the Gaza Strip will be changed fundamentally. Those are our aims. So after a week of warfare, we find ourselves in a very challenging situation, in a war that we didn't start and that we didn't ask for, that was forced upon us by some of the most brutal attacks ever seen in modern history. We are happy to see, and it warms our hearts, that there is such an outpour of support for Israel by the foreign ministers of the US, the UK, the European Union, France, Germany, and many, many others that have not only said, but made action, came to Israel, visited Israel, and saw firsthand the atrocities that were done against our civilians. And it's important that everybody around the world, every freedom-loving nation and person, will continue to support Israel, the good, against Hamas, which is the evil. And that may sound simplistic, but that's as simple as it needs to be. We are fighting a force of evil, and we are focused on defeating it, and we will not rest until it is defeated. I would like to say that I hope next week will be better than this, but we know that we are in for a long, challenging, and difficult time. We're committed, we're focused, we are equipped and ready to fight until we dismantle Hamas. If you like our content, please share it with your friends, and make sure that anybody who cares or has an opinion about things happening in the Middle East sees our content and understands our perspective. I thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best.